All right, welcome everybody. I'm Ken Williford. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Humanities here, and the advisor of Faith and Answers, even though I myself am faithless, religiously speaking anyway, and have few answers, mostly questions. So I thought maybe the group should be called Dalvin Questions, but anyway. So before we begin, I'd like to make just a few comments before I turn over to Mason. Let's remember an idea of Gandhi's, that even though we may all have strongly held views that motivate us to act, often in opposition to those we disagree with, we should also adopt the principle of ahimsa, or non-harmfulness, maintaining respect for all and an open-minded humility, since one might always be wrong and one has much to learn from one's opponents, even if one is not ever persuaded by them. Second, let's remember some fairly well-established findings in cognitive psychology. If a position is held strongly and, so to speak, touches nerves, it becomes harder to listen to those holding the opposite position, harder even to understand them, but it also becomes harder to look into one's own reasons objectively. Relatedly, the stronger one's commitment to a position, the lower the standard to which one tends to hold arguments for that position, and the higher the standard to which one tends to hold arguments against a position. Finally, I just want to exhort everyone to remain respectful and generous during this discussion and afterwards during the Q&A. And if it's posted online, all of you out there in cyberspace, please be respectful. It takes a lot of courage to talk on these issues publicly. We must make every effort in this debate and in many others that divide our nation to finally listen to one another respectfully and be willing at least to try to reason together. We may never agree on the issues discussed tonight, but we should not let this lead us to disrespect or dehumanize one another. And we should remain committed to the ideal of rational mutual understanding. With that, I'm going to turn it over to me.
Thank you, Dr. Williford. My name is Mason Kelso. I'm the president of Faith and Answers. I just want to echo, before I present or introduce our presenters, I'd like to echo Dr. Williford's comments. This topic is often filled with divisive rhetoric as compared to substantive dialogue. So people here tonight are almost surely going to hear positions that they disagree with, some that they might even find disgusting. What we need to do is learn how to elevate the quality of our dialogue and just give everyone an ear. There's one quote that I'd like to share. I think you one-upped me with the Gandhi, to be honest with you. I don't know how I beat Gandhi, but I'll try. John Stuart Mill once wrote, "He who knows his own side of an argument knows little at that. His reasons may be good, and no one may be able to refute them. But if he's equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, and if he does not so much as even know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." This is a motivating sentiment behind tonight's event and Faith and Answers mission as a whole. So we would appreciate everyone's observance of that sentiment. Tonight's event is going to consist of 3 parts. First, each presenter is going to be given 10 to 12 minutes to offer a brief introduction to their position. Second, we're going to have a roughly 1-hour dialogue in which each professor will present at least one question to one another, a question that they personally find most pertinent to tonight's topic. We will then be given a 10-minute intermission, let you guys get a break, followed by a 20 to 30-minute question and answer period. You'll likely notice that there is an index card around you or placed on your seat. The reason for that is if you wish to ask a question anonymously, just write down your answer, or your question rather, and just place it anywhere on the table here, and we'll get to it after our live microphone Q&A period. Also, if you guys want to check us out on YouTube, you can do that at Faith and Answers. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our 3 speakers. Dr. Charles Hermes is going to represent our skeptical position tonight. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Florida State University and is currently a lecturer here at UTA. His research interests include logic, moral problems, and the philosophy of science. We do fun facts here. I don't know if you've been to our events, but fun fact for him is his favorite poet, after all his learning, is still Shel Silverstein. where the sidewalk ends, baby. Dr. Sally Parker Ryan is tonight's pro-choice representative. She received her doctorate in philosophy from the University of Sydney and is currently a lecturer here at UTA and Houston Community College. And her research interests include topics spanning from the philosophy of language to ethics. Here's the funnest fact that I've heard thus far. She knows the names, the personalities, pretty much all attributes of 50 Pokemon.
At least.
So, yeah, and you know she has a kid, but you know, you love Pokemon.
It's also my private interest.
She loved Pokemon way before the kid. All right, Dr. Ferrer is tonight's pro-life representative. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and is currently a researcher and writer whose research interests include anything related to the philosophy of religion alongside the ethics of abortion. Fun fact for Dr. Ferrer is he once taught a lecture at the same university as Thomas Aquinas. Not the same semester. So if everyone could just give a warm welcome to our speakers. Hot mic for sure. We're going to start with Dr. Hermes.
Well, since we're starting with such a controversial topic, I figured I'd present what hopefully is the least controversial claim of the day. None of these could really be about what the abortion debate's about, though. I mean, why couldn't these be what the abortion debate's about? Because if they were, then what you would be saying is that your opponent doesn't understand those things. And clearly that isn't the mistake that the pro-lifer or the pro-choicer is making. And yet this rhetoric seems to fit so well whichever side of the debate we're on. And there's a reason for this. It's because so frequently in public sphere debates, we don't pay attention to conceptual distinctions. And there's a very important distinction going on in the abortion debate, or in the debate about what grounds a right to life, that's frequently missed when we talk about this in the public sphere. It's the distinction between what it is to be a person and what it is to be a human being. We sometimes use these words as if they're interchangeable, but we don't always do so. And I think the first time this really shocked me, and really kind of maybe the day I thought I was going to be a philosopher, was back when I was in Sunday school as a kid. And I remember being told, God is a person. And I thought to myself, ha-ha, fools. Fingers, toes, cute little nose. Of course that's not God, right? But the mistake wasn't a mistake that the theologian was making. It was a mistake that I was making. I didn't realize that when they said God was a person, they did not mean God was a human being. They mean something different. You can see the same thing from animal rights activists. Animal rights activists frequently claim that apes are people too. As a matter of fact, Spain has declared that apes are people. And if you think of the term person or the term human as meaning the same thing, this is just nutty. Apes are human beings as well? That's clearly not what they're saying. Or if it were, they'd be saying something insane. So what are they saying? What's the difference between these two different concepts? And the difference actually isn't that difficult to figure out. I mean, if you think of what it is to be a human being, it's to be a member of our species. To be a human being is to be an animal of a particular sort, our sort. To be a person, though, seems to be something different. Because God clearly is not a human being. Not in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. At least, same thing, apes clearly aren't human beings. So when we talk about apes being people too, it seems like we're talking about something different. When we talk about God being a person too, it seems like we're talking about something different. It seems like what we're talking here is about a capacity concept. Now, why does this matter? How does it kind of help us look back at what's going on in this dispute and why people are talking past each other? Think two claims like, looking at the sonogram and the fingers and the toes and the cute little nose, what are these really arguments for? What are these things that they're trying to convince us of? Or abortion stops at beating heart. What are we trying to be convinced of when we hear these slogans? I think it's quite clear. We're being convinced that this is a living organism, right? And not only is it a living organism, take a look at it. Look how much it looks like us. It's not just a living organism, it's a living organism of our species. And that's actually true at a really early stage of development. After all, there are two cell organisms. When we take a look at what happens at conception, and the pro-lifer tells us life begins at conception, we should argue here. We should recognize what they're saying is just a basic fact of biology. And when they say, what species is that thing? That's also not where it really belongs. Because when you take a look at what the species is, all we need to ask ourselves is, what was its parentage? To be a member of a species is just to say you're an organism that came off some branch of the evolutionary tree. So what species is that thing? Is it a human being? Is it an organism? Yes. But then there's the second question. This is a question we frequently don't ask. We ask the question, when does life begin? But the real question we ought to be thinking about is this question. What is it that grounds the right to life? Because these two things aren't the same question. It can't be humanness that grounds the right to life. And we know this. We know this for at least two reasons. One is, imagine that some intelligent aliens with the exact same capacities we have came to Earth. And you thought, what should you do? Well, you shot them. Or Mickey Mouse. Get that mousetrap in. There's something wrong there. If Mickey existed and you killed him, it would be wrong for the exact same reason it would be wrong to kill me, even though he wouldn't be my species. If the alien came to Earth and you killed it, it would be wrong for the exact same reason that it's wrong to kill me. So it's the speed. So if what you think is just because this is a living being and is human, that's what matters, you're missing something here. There's a second reason also to worry, a reason in the exact opposite direction. Some babies are born with this disease called anencephaly. And what happens with this disease is you're born without the formation of large sections of your brain. So what you can have is this baby that's born with nothing but the brainstem. That brainstem is going to keep that baby's heart beating. It's going to keep them being able to breathe. But there's no place for cognition. There's no place to feel pain, to have awareness. This being is clearly human. It's clearly a living organism of our species, but has nothing it is like to be like. And we know this because there's no place for that cognition to occur. You ask people, does this thing have the same right to life that we do? And the standard answer is that there's no experience. There's no pain. There's no place for that experience to occur. And then no, even though it's human. So it seems like humanists can't be what's pulling the trick. You move to the second line. So I don't mean this, hey, look, the pro-lifers in trouble here, because it seems like what their rhetoric points us to is this concept of humanness, and it can't be that that's doing the work. But the pro-choice rhetoric has the exact same problem. It points towards a concept, not the concept of being a human, but the concept of being a person. What is it to be a person? Well, there's something about our cognitive capacities that make us very different than at least most other things we run into. Maybe some of the higher organisms also have these same types of capacities, but there's something about us, capacity-wise, that's relatively unique. And a good way to think about this is, I guess I didn't come here with notes, I'm hoping I do well, but let me give you a story of why I don't have notes. Maybe true, may not. Mine's always fun. But, so here's what happened. I had notes to present this talk with. But Katie, just an hour before the presentation, tore them up and threw them all over my living room. You see, I wasn't spending enough time loving Katie, and she was really bothered by this. So it seems like she wanted, I guess, I don't know what she wanted. I don't know what's the right word here. I don't know what was going on in her mind. There's an interesting question that you need to ask to understand how that story turns out and how I should respond to that story. Who's Katie? Katie's my dog, as it turns out. And my response here is very different than if Katie were my wife. And there's a reason my response is very different than if Katie were my wife. Because the way I act with my dog is very different than the way I act with my wife. Or I'd be divorced. And there's a reason for this. Because she has the capacity to recognize reasons and act according to reason, the sorts of actions that would be, the sorts of reasons why I should be behaving in that way are different. She could sit back and recognize, yeah, I'm really going to annoy him, and act for that reason, which is very different than the rationality that my dog would be going through. And I want to blame her in a way I don't blame Katie. I may want to try to modify Katie's behavior, but the blame component seems very different in my response to Katie, my dog, than it would be if it were a man and my wife who did the same thing. Same thing we used to give this, he's older now, he's past 5, but I remember one of the first times I was talking about this topic is my son was just 1 and my other one was 16. And notice there's a very fundamental difference between the way I want to treat them. This difference is something to do with personhood. And personhood is a tough concept to actually spell exactly how you want to define it, but it seems like at the very least, it's something about this ability to act for reasons. It's something about this ability to be responsible in some sort of sense for our actions in a way that my dog isn't. And here's something you know. An acorn isn't an oak tree. The fetus certainly isn't a person. It does not have those capacities. It may become something with those capacities later on, but certainly a fetus is not, and as a matter of fact, at no point in its development will it become a person. I mean, at what point do you blame the fetus for kicking the mom in the stomach, right? But if you then want to think that that's what's grounding the right to life, you've got a huge problem. And the reason you've got a huge problem is because if personhood is what's pulling the trick, then not only does the fetus at no point during development have this, but young children below, it's really tough to put the age here. You actually have you've got different debates of where does personhood begin. But clearly the 6-month-old doesn't have it. So where does it start? Well beyond the point where we need to say that thing has a right to life. So humanist isn't going to work, personhood isn't going to work, and then you think, okay, but you see that's slightly more sophisticated. I'm going to say that if I had an hour, we could talk about a lot of more ways, but I put a little bit of time. So let me just talk about 2 different ways you might want to tweak these accounts. If you're the pro-lifer, what you might think is, what I want to point to is I want to point to capacities, right? I might think it's not just being a human being, it's not just that you are a person, because you're not going to be yet as a fetus, but it's because you've got the capacity to develop into a being that has these powers, right? If only I were in the right circumstance long enough, then I'd have this ability. But if you say that, then you ought to be just as opposed to contraception and masturbation as you are to abortion. Because in the right circumstances, so will the egg cell. Every time we look at a wasted egg cell or a wasted sperm cell, we've got the exact same problem. So if it's that capacity issue, then here's the problem. Teenagers just aren't having enough sex. But that can't be it. Second thing you could do, suppose you're the pro-choicer. Here's what you might think. You might think, it's capacities. It is a capacity concept. That's what you care about. But personhood is too high. We've got to lower that bar. Maybe what we want to worry about is the capacity to feel pain, right? And that's going to get us at least a large number of the abortions that you want to have permissible. But if that's how low you put that bar, you want to say anything with that has the right to life that we have, then you better be a vegan. Because if the capacity to feel pain is what we care about, if that's what the abortion's all about, then maybe late-stage abortions are really bad. Like as bad as eating a McDonald's hamburger. And I think the point that I really want to stress is that if you really try to be conceptually clear of what's going on here, you probably are going to have to bite the bullet. Whatever take you take on what grounds a right to life, it's not going to be this happy-faced solution. It's going to be something with some cost. And what we ought to do is realize that reasonable people can bite different bullets. Thank you.
Dr. Ryan, would you like to go next? Okay.
Okay.
You get
All right. So, thank you to Charles for making some of those conceptual issues clear, what the problems are. I want to take a pro-choice position, and the reason that I'm taking a pro-choice position is because I want to consider rights and obligations and the interaction of rights and obligations. I have a sort of general observations to make, and I have a detailed account that we're not going to have time for. But let me say this. In a community of moral agents, we're pretty continuously trying to balance our rights and obligations. So that one set of rights can encroach on some other set of rights. One of the most disappointing things that I've come across in this discussion about abortion, and this is not my particular area of expertise, but in the last 2 weeks, just reading through the literature, is the failure to keep a woman's rights in view. They just keep slipping out somehow. And the lack of compassion for the reality of a woman's situation when it comes to sex and reproduction and childbearing. A recurring image, seems to me, where abortion is allowed is that of a woman getting to reap all the benefits of the liberated sex life without having to shoulder any of the responsibilities. So it's an image I've seen stir up a lot of a special kind of resentment. It's an image of someone getting something for free. And so I see that image getting mixed up in the basically good and heartfelt intuitions about the rights of babies. But you know, the image is, how dare a woman enjoy herself at the cost of a baby's life? Now, this is depressing misrepresentation of what's going on. But I want to focus for a minute on this idea of responsibilities and of the consequences of sex, if you will. Both men and women enjoy sex. We know in the modern world the responsibility for contraception falls on both members of a couple. That a child that results from sex is as much a responsibility as a mother's. And we see lots of equality between men and women, mums and dads these days, which is all good. But there's a dislocation here. And the woman is asked to shoulder a further responsibility. A responsibility that's made to be deeply moral. To see through to birth a human life. On the pro-life view, a woman has a moral responsibility not to abort or to seek to have aborted a fetus that, whatever the circumstances got there, I would say, is now present in her body and requires the use of her body to be brought to term, even if she doesn't want the pregnancy and didn't choose it willingly. Now my question is this: why must a woman bear this extra moral responsibility merely because of her biology? Why must a woman have to, on pain of immorality, offer her body to bear and bring forth a life if she hasn't chosen it? Men might be asked to pay up financially when a child comes into the picture, or they might be asked to help or even shoulder all of the childcare. But they're not asked to give up their bodies to be used to bear and bring forth a life for another 9 months. Why must the mere shape and function of one's internal organs accrue, along with the biological capability, also a moral obligation to allow that biological capacity to be used against one's will? Now, men and women are equal, and yet a woman's right to be the one in charge of what happens in and to her body is supposed to be trumped by conception. Whatever the circumstances of the fetus, she has to allow the pregnancy to proceed, even if she doesn't want this. There's nothing even close to this that we ask of men. Imagine a science fiction, future, pretend, made-up world, where it's possible for fetuses plus womb and everything to be transferred into men somehow. Wow, this would be great, you might think. Now men can experience pregnancy. Now tell them that whether they like it or not, they're going to be forced to carry all fetuses. I don't mean one man has to carry all fetuses. I mean that any fetuses that are to be carried are going to be carried by men. And tell them that unless they stop having sex altogether, from now on, it's going to be their responsibility to bring all babies into the world. They have no choice but to undergo the procedure to transfer the womb and fetus into them every time they get a woman pregnant. So I think if men and women are equal, then we should, by rights, be able to force them to do this. We should be able to force them to have that procedure and make it law, even. Now, forcing anyone to undergo any procedure to his or her body is, I think, or at least I want to suggest, grossly immoral. The argument that abortion raises an unacceptable moral risk to the right to life of a fetus ignores the possibility that it's equally morally unacceptable to violate a person's right to choose what procedures happen to his or her body. Now, I want to quote something that I just read recently, and it's from an interview with a Dr. Willie Parker. I don't know if any of you know this person. He's just written a book called Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice, and he's a black man and a devout Christian. And he was giving an interview that I read appropriately on the online blog Jezebel. Dr. Parker provides abortions for women in the Deep South, where access to safe abortion care is very limited and where they might otherwise be performed in back alleys. Now, in Dr. Parker's view, to quote the article, he says, abortion is an act of compassion in accordance with Christianity. He says a pregnancy that intimates a baby is not more sacred than abortion. What's sacred, what's godlike, is a woman's agency, the part that makes a choice. He goes on to say, I believe that men and women are equal in their agency, and if women have moral agency and autonomy, that means that all processes that occur in their body should be governed by that woman's decision making. So what that means is that people should not be able to have laws that allow them to be more preoccupied with the well-being of the fetus that a woman is carrying than with the woman. Now, moreover, Dr. Parker makes the following point, which is central to my view, and I see that I'm probably going over time here. He says, you can debate whether or not a fetus is a person, but there's no question that a woman is a person. And so the question is, at what point is a woman not a person? At what point does a woman lose her right to be self-governing and to have bodily integrity? If it means anything to have personhood, agency and autonomy to the degree that men have that, then women have to have it, or it means nothing. So, now let me just finish this little bit. The pro-life position here is this. Shouldn't the mother bear some responsibility for bearing the fetus that, whatever the circumstances, is now inside her body and requires her body to survive? The fetus is an innocent human being. It has a right to life by virtue of that mere fact, according to the pro-life position. Shouldn't this right to life of an innocent baby not be violated because perhaps it's a bit inconvenient for a woman to bear it? Does she, just because it's inconvenient, have a right to kill an innocent baby? Well, using terms like innocent baby and killing are unfair. They invoke emotionally charged images that prejudice the issue that we're trying to consider here. They assume the conclusion of what they're arguing for, that a fetus has a right to life that trumps the right to bodily autonomy of a woman. But we can't assume that. Firstly, there's an assumption that all life is sacred, that every living thing has an inviolable and equal right to life. Therefore, a woman's right to be in charge of the uses of her body is always trumped by the right to life of the fetus. This is taken to be axiomatic. But it simply isn't. Alive things get killed every day for the convenience of us. We have a death penalty in this country. Nobody would suggest that one shouldn't kill another if it's it's not even to a certain degree, it's even morally condoned to a certain degree to kill to protect a loved one, say to protect your own child or family. In war, we kill thousands of innocent human beings, including babies. So being alive is not the same as having a right to life. Amoeba are alive, I think. So are ants, spiders, plants, and cells cultured in the petri dishes of scientists everywhere. Moreover, even forms of conventional contraception don't prevent the fertilization of an egg. They merely prevent it from implanting in the womb. I know there are some, perhaps many, who disagree with conception too. But for those who accept it, it has to be explained why this is okay and abortion is not. Okay, so at any rate, it seems unquestionable that merely to be alive is not the same as having a right to life. And moreover, even having a right to life is not absolute. It's not inviolable at all costs, no matter how tragic, cruel, or evil those costs might be. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to make a note about the terminology I'm going to be using. I consistently and deliberately use the phrase child in utero. I need to explain this. This term has legal precedent. It was used in court cases regarding the Lacey and Connor law, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. So I'm using a technically precise term that refers to a child in the form of the offspring of the mother while in utero. So, excuse me. So that's important. I do not use the term fetus, as I understand that to be a description of a stage of development, but not an entity. So fetus is, it runs the risk of biasing people away from recognizing that this is a human being we're talking about. So just clarification, and hopefully that will keep this from being terribly offensive here. We are probably all familiar with the triad of human rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In civil society, it's generally granted that every human being, at least from birth onward, has a right to life as a basic human right. These rights are common fare in philosophical ethics and political science. These lines are the vindication of many centuries of hard-fought political philosophy, which I will not rehash here. You can applause internally here. White people, black people, brown, men and women alike all have an equal right to life. Perhaps people can surrender that right through criminality or warfare, but in civil society there's no real debate about whether there exists a right to life. But when we ask about what grounds the right to life, that's not as clear. We're digging into foundational stuff now, asking about what makes the right to life real, true, or factual. In other words, what makes the right to life an actual right? If the truth maker for this human rights claim extends only to white people, then the right to life is racist. If only to adults, then it's ageist. If only to men, then it's sexist. If the right to life extends to all human beings, however, then it can be understood in a broadly non-discriminatory way, an equal rights way. This is the equalitarian sense of human rights. This is the sense I will be defending tonight. I will argue tonight that the right to life as a human right should be considered as extending to all humanity as such, that is, biological humanity. Clearly stated, the burden of proof is on the abortion choice advocate to show beyond a reasonable doubt that humans in utero are not human enough to qualify for this most basic human right. Reasonable doubt is sufficient cause to render a hung jury, and without any deaths and withhold any death sentence, especially when this death sentence yearly imperils millions of morally and legally innocent human beings. We are not justified in overruling even a potential claim to the right to life on the basis of a maybe. Notice, I'm not arguing that we have certain knowledge regarding what grounds the right to life. I'm not even arguing that we need to come close to that level of certainty. I'm arguing that because there exists reasonable doubt on this issue, we are justified in abstaining from practice, promotion, and policy making in favor of abortion choice. Now, stated positively, I'm arguing that the pro-life position is morally and legally justified for people who are agnostic, moderate, or even just a little unsure about what grounds the right to life. To begin, consider these familiar lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This line of the Declaration of Independence is a beachhead in the fight for human rights, perhaps as much as any other sentence from the modern era. At the time it was written, the U.S. exercised British common law, including a general ban on abortion from what they thought was the beginning of human life. That is, the first fetal movement, also known as the quickening. But as science gradually revealed that human life begins at conception, abortion laws adjusted accordingly. Abortion remained taboo among the Founding Fathers. The only abortions they permitted did not qualify in their understanding as abortions. Also note that this line distills some sophisticated political philosophy from that era, including John Locke, Thomas Paine, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This line declares a bold and liberal view of human rights, a vindication of Enlightenment humanism, where the right to life is self-evident, intrinsic, inalienable, and universal. The somewhat archaic usage of the term men has since been clarified as including all humankind regardless of sex, gender, color, or creed. The right to life is not a fiat of a government, a privilege earned by wealth or family status, nor some gift bestowed by the community on privileged individuals. The right to life is just a moral fact about our humanity from our creation onward. But at what point are we humans created? A new human, Homo sapiens, begins at conception, which has been admitted here. There's no scientific debate on this either. New biological life begins when sperm fertilizes egg, not when you have an individual sperm or an individual egg. That's not scientifically the same thing. So updating the terminology then, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all humans are equals at conception. We also have here a preliminary answer to tonight's prompt. What grounds the right to life? Well, the answer is that we are endowed by our Creator with the right to life. That Creator could be nature, or God, or the flying spaghetti monster. The founders wisely avoided any specifics there. Now, I could argue that the right to life traces back to God, and that only within some brand of theism do any moral values make sense, including the right to life. I've argued that position before, and you're free to ask about that in the Q&A afterwards. But for my purposes here, it's sufficient to show that the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and most of the court history, legal history, and natural law ethic tradition that has been built on that, all these together suggest that it's reasonable to believe that the right to life is a fact of our humanity from our creation onward. I'm a human rights activist, a realist, and a natural law theorist. So I'm not prepared to discard the hard-fought history and apparent foundations of the right to life. I have no problem agreeing with the founders that the right to life is self-evident, grounded in our humanity, and it applies from the moment of conception. But here's the kicker. The pro-life position doesn't require we prove all these things. We need only have reasonable doubt before we are justified in withholding a death sentence. In this case, we have plenty of doubt about when the right to life begins. Number two, what grounds the right to life? And how does that right measure against privacy rights? We could all hold to an agnostic position, and we'd still not be justified in denying abortion choice. In denying abortion choice, since death sentences cannot rightly hinge on a quote, maybe. Now comes the key turning point for my argument. In 99% of cases, abortion is a death sentence against an innocent, non-combatant, non-threatening child in utero. But death sentences shouldn't be issued where there's reasonable doubt about whether it's ethically justified. But I showed you above reasonable doubt. Therefore, abortion isn't justified. This argument can be summarized as three premises: a life bias premise, a reasonable doubt premise, and the conclusion. First, premise one, the life bias premise. Because of the apparent importance of the right to life, death sentences are not to be issued except when we have reasonable certainty that it's justified. Premise two, the reasonable doubt premise. Abortion is a death sentence with an abundance of reasonable doubt. In conclusion, therefore, abortion isn't justified. Now, what I'm asserting here in the first premise is that it's unethical to rule against a distinct human life unless there exists reasonable certainty that that killing is justified. We could list several reasons for this life bias. Reason number one, intuition. We intuitively understand the axiom, you might know this from Ronald Reagan's fame, if you don't know, don't shoot. This keeps hunters from accidentally shooting their buddy when they thought it was actually a bird that was causing a rustling in the trees. So if you don't know, don't shoot. That's intuitively compelling. Number 2, medical ethics. It's a basic to medical ethics to do no harm. And then number 2, to do good. And the classic Hippocratic bans, the Hippocratic Oath is what medical professionals had to swear on. It got adjusted in 1964, but the classic form of it for thousands of years banned euthanasia and abortion. Number 3, the gravity of killing. Because killing is an irreversible act, we should take strict measures to make sure it's not murder, or manslaughter, or even criminal negligence. Number 4, legal implications. The life bias is implied within the checks and balances of our capital crimes court system. The individual is innocent until proven guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, and decided by a unanimous decision and a jury of one's peers. These are checks and balances to make sure that we never extend a death sentence without the highest level of criteria. Yes, the right to life can be revoked, but we have a lot of checks and balances to keep that revocation from being illegitimate. And number 5, fallibility. We have erred before on personhood. We have erred before on personhood to horrific effect. Hence, we are justified in maintaining a bias in favor of life, giving life the benefit of the doubt, so long as there's reasonable doubt. Regarding premise 2, the reasonable doubt premise, we can list several evidences. Here are some. Personhood still admits wide disagreement among reasonable people. Number 2, abortion practice is death profiteering. Number 3, abortion is child abuse, or at least animal abuse. Number 4, abortion choice policy enables race-based and sex-selective abortions. Abortion caters to the exploitation of women by accommodating, now notice I'm not saying abortion makes this happen, I'm saying it makes it easier for these practices, by accommodating sex trafficking, coerced abortion, and objectifying women. That is, boys can more easily use and discard girls for sex because they don't have to worry as much about childbirth later. Abortion helps foster irresponsibility. It can, it doesn't in every case. Helps foster irresponsibility, selfishness, and similar vices. Abortion is connected with a range of unnecessary health risks, including perforation, scarring, hemorrhage, infection, sepsis, laceration, premature births, miscarriage, and some say it's also connected to depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, relational problems, and sexual dysfunction. Abortion, number 8, treats human beings like property, disposable objects at the behest of others. Number 9, when the euphemisms surrounding the pro-choice position are stripped away, the abortion choice position looks pretty ugly. When we no longer say fetus, but we say child, admitting that the mother already has a relation to her child in utero. Abortion has become, number 10, abortion has become the single deadliest act against fellow man in world history. At over 59 million killed in the U.S. just since 1973 and 1.4 billion worldwide since 1980. I'd call those reasonable doubt. In conclusion, we have reason to believe that the human right to life begins at conception. Furthermore, we have an abundance of evidence demonstrating that even if we were not sure about the grounding for the right to life, we cannot safely side in favor of abortion choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. That is going to give us a lot to work with for the next hour. All right. So our first line of questioning, Dr. Ryan, I believe we're going to start with you to Dr. Ferrer. And if I needed to reword this, just let me know. She's asking if you argue that we don't have enough certainty about the moral status of abortion, and that in order to play it safe, we should just ban abortion now. If we grant that, then what would that even look like? Is that...
So there's something missing. If, hang on, where's my... all right, so if you argue that it's a kind of a moral hazard argument, or a sort of Pascal's wager argument, I suppose, that there's reasonable doubt about the right to life of the fetus, that therefore we shouldn't take the risk because it's not morally safe. So what I'm wondering is that what would some sort of certainty look like? I mean, there's really, I don't know a lot of moral certainties. I mean, you know, there are obviously cases from the past that we look back and we say, well, that's clearly wrong. There's something about this case that I'm wondering what it would look like for us to be certain that a fetus has a right to life. How could we ascertain that?
That's a good question. Regarding reasonable certainty, I'm not trying to put in some artificial distinction that's impossible to reach. I'm trying to deal in something that has fair court precedence. The same kind of standard that it would take, for example, to demonstrate, say, a capital offender. The same sort of evidence and argument that it would take to prove that someone was guilty of a capital crime.
Right.
Now, one of the challenges we have with human rights and the right to life specifically is that human rights are this kind of amorphous overlap between two highly contested fields. You've got international politics, you've got, and then you've got ethics, and none of these guys are mathematicians in terms of the certainty of the claims that they're making. You just don't get there. So you have to deal with imperfect levels of reasonable certainty. That is beyond a reasonable doubt. And I would ask something at least comparable or an effort in that direction to suspend a policy that extends what's literally the deadliest death sentence policy that we've seen in world history. At least suspend it till we can come up with some high degree of agreement, maybe. Now, that's not to say that your points are invalid. I think the woman's well-being, health, and autonomy need to be serious considerations in here. But I would suggest that pulling back on abortion liberties actually has a greater chance to benefit women more. Because for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, abortion policy might really be catering to objectifying women as sex objects and giving them a little bit less liberty in a free society.
I just have to make a point there, and that is that the outcomes, if we're going to be considering this in utilitarian terms, is, you know, a very different outcome. A very different argument from considering what grounds the right to life. I mean, whether outcomes are good or bad, well, we can debate that because there's certainly some very bad outcomes for denying safe abortions to women as well. I don't have those statistics, and I'm pretty sure that you don't either, and I feel as though bringing out, speculating about how bad the outcomes are is a little bit beside the point here.
What did you say? I don't have the statistics on what?
So,
because I might.
Okay, you might have some. For example, that there were a lot of bad things that you were mentioning, but I would really like to see some more solid evidence for them panning out. For example, that. Okay, so the idea that it might actually lead to, I mean, there's a lot of slippery slope arguments there. It might actually lead to female exploitation. Because, well, look, I mean, I don't think that men are going to stop exploiting women because they're not allowed to have abortions. I find that hard to believe, and I can't see any way that you could possibly show that unless,
Yeah, utopia can't be a frame of reference here because no side here believes that utopia is possible.
No, obviously.
Where men all of them will start respecting women as they deserve. I doubt that'll happen.
I think there are bad outcomes on both sides of the coin here, but we can't use those as the basis of our argument about the rights.
I would suggest that outcomes matter. I'm not a utilitarian. I gave a natural law argument. as it's expressed with some founding documents and that kind of thing. But outcomes do matter, and if we roll out policy that's not wisely considerate of what's likely to happen if we do this, then that's not good practical ethics. Not even getting into legal matters.
It has to be evidence-based. We can't
Agreed.
merely speculate that these bad things are going to happen.
Have you seen the movie Hush? I'd recommend it to anybody here. It's put on by a pro-choice advocate who calls herself pro-information, and she put together a lot of good evidence in a documentary style, so it's nice and presentable. A lot of good evidence to show that there are some escalated dangers involved with the abortion procedure. Now, I'm not a medical professional. I don't want to quote all that. I've got some of it here, but it doesn't sound like it's going to satisfy the sourcing that you're looking for, but I can send that to you later if you're interested.
It's a medical procedure, and there are always risks with medical procedures. But this, again, is totally off the question of what grounds the right to life, and
I do want to stay on track. Yeah.
And where the interaction of the woman's rights and the right to life connect. This stuff is totally off. I mean, for example, we could simply stop requiring women to bear children and bear them in, when the technology is available in test tubes. Okay, so women's bodies no longer need to be used, and therefore abortion is no longer a problem for women because it's not their bodies that are being used.
It's an interesting scenario, but I don't know what to do with that because, if that were possible, that would solve a lot of the dilemma for sure. So that I think a lot of pro-choicers and pro-lifers might actually be able to line up on that.
Okay, so we have to, not rely on...
Because I'm pro-life, woman's life and the child's life as well.
Okay. I won't keep questioning you on that. Thank you for answering.
Okay. All right. The next line of questioning is for Dr. Ryan to Dr. Hermes. Dr. Hermes, if both sides' arguments are bad or insufficient, how do we make any progress? Do you think that our conceptual confusions can be overcome?
Yes, I think what we need is we need more conversations like this. And I think when we have more conversations like this, we can see how frequently what ends up happening is we end up talking past each other. So what we have is we have this sort of worry, which so frequently becomes the end-all be-all for this abortion debate of, well, are we killing a human being when we have an abortion? But when we start thinking what it is to be human, if that's the issue, then the answer becomes quite clear. On the other hand, we immediately move from there to this assumption, well, look, I can show that more human beings have been killed by abortion than any other practice we've had. Therefore, this means we ought to be pro-life. But again, we stop and ask ourselves, what is it that's doing the work here? If it's just the fact that it's a living being, that can't be it. If it's just the fact that it's a human being, that's speciesist. So what we have then is a sort of miscommunication, I think, that happens on both sides of the debate. We start thinking of, is this a case of, is this a human being? We also get this issue of rights. I think this is kind of an interesting thing to be thinking about, is the way we're using this term here. I don't think we're necessarily using it in the same sense, and this may be problematic. If we're thinking of rights as some sort of legal doctrine, then we're thinking and talking about something very different than if we think of rights as inalienable things that we have endowed by a creator. Right? If we're thinking of rights as inalienable things that we have by a creator, then legal documents don't really have much of a say in here. So then what ends up happening, I think, is we've got to shift our conversations, and we've got to start shifting how we're talking past each other to start talking with each other about these sorts of things. And I guess it's kind of, I'm in a weird position here, because I want to, my goal is to basically say it's not a matter of lack of certainty that matters here. It's a recognition that any answer you give will be partially a bad answer, because there will be costs to any answer you give. And the way to find out what the costs are is to talk with each other, start making sure we're using the same language, start making sure that we're really on the same page in these sorts of dialogues. And in the end, I don't think we're going to get a happy face solution. I don't think we're going to get the solution that all the intuitions I've ever wanted as a pro-lifer I'm going to get. or if I am a pro-choicer, all the intuitions I have as a pro-choicer I'm going to get. In the end, I think both sides are going to have to surrender some things. But that surrender will never happen unless dialogues like these occur. So it's not, I mean, my skepticism is really a skepticism of admit human fallibility, admit how much we really have got to work at understanding this issue, and the only way it's going to happen is by getting the two of you sitting here together and talking.
What do you guys think? Thoughts?
I heard some preliminary critiques of a pro-choice position in your opening statement, but it sounded like the indecision practically works out. It's still against a pro-life position. Am I understanding you correctly? My official stance for this evening is no. There's good arguments on both sides. Okay. I mean, if my goal here today is going to be a little bit strained, because what I'm going to hopefully do both during our discussion and through the Q&A is not bias on either side. I think it would be unfair to me to do so on a three-person panel. I'm either a pro-lifer or a pro-choicer, but that is no bearing. That's a
this
tense
conversation. So my goal is to try as much as I can not to tip the hat in either direction, but to the best I can to point to the fact that if we can move past some of these conceptual distinctions and start recognizing that we may be using words in different ways, and recognize that there's actually issues that we can be talking about here, we can have a more fruitful debate.
I like how you mentioned the two leading diverging views on what the grounds for rights are. Is it grounded in some theological concept, some God, or is it grounded in a government, some sort of convention of a group of sorts, government or governments?
I don't think it's either. I don't think either makes sense.
I agree.
I don't think you can say
sort
that.
of.
I think what you want is this. Take this as a myth or as a reality. God created us with certain inalienable rights. But when you say that, you can drop God out of the picture or keep God in the picture. It's being the sorts of beings that we are. We have certain sorts of rights, whether we were created by nature or by God that way. Now, the problem is if you think the law is the thing grounding it, you've denied the very concept of inalienable rights. Because if the law is the thing that's grounding it, then inalienable rights remember what it is to be an inalienable right. Inalienable right is the sort of thing that cannot be taken or given away.
If the government is the deepest basis for a right, then they can revoke that right.
Right. And you can't complain then that people in other countries are having their rights violated if the government doesn't respect those rights. You can't talk about violations of women's rights in other countries unless you accept that there's such a thing as a woman's right on the basis that she's a woman. Yeah. You can't talk about the violations of the fetus's right to life if you think all that right is grounded in the law, because that's just human arbitrary decisions, right? Yeah. Now, I think thinking about it as God-given rights makes perfectly good sense. If what you mean is God made us as beings like we are, and because of being those sorts of beings, we've got these rights. Or you could think of this in a naturalistic sense. Nature developed us in the ways that we are. And then the tricky question becomes, which ways are we that ground those rights? And that's where I think coming to the issues of humanness, coming to the issues of personhood, coming to the issue of capacity, coming to the sorts of the four distinctions I was looking at, and recognize that each one of these have problems. But where is the right grounded in? It's grounded in me being the sort of being I am. And then what is it about me that gives me that right to life? And then when I answer that question, I know the question of how to apply that to the fetus. But any answer to that question is going to bite a bullet.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Hermes, you have a question for Dr. Ryan and Dr. Ferrer. What considerations, and I really like this one, what considerations or arguments from the opposing side do you find the most powerful or compelling?
And can I put an addendum here? I'm not saying necessarily like what the other person just got done saying.
Right.
I think whoever you think of as the opposition here, what do you think the strongest things are for this? And I guess the reason for the question is because I think what we need to recognize is the best way to actually get anywhere is to acknowledge each other and both of us.
Do you want to go first? I want to go first.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to come back to the conceptual confusions again in a minute, but I will answer this question because I like it too. I think that's a nice way to take into consideration the seriousness with which we ought to be taking each other. So my, I guess what I think is good and beneficial, let's say, about the right to life argument is the seriousness with which it takes this miracle of life, if we want to call it a miracle, that we as yet have not been able to build a human being. And so there's something there. There's something about the potential for that thing to become a human being that will be potentially loved, that potentially will give love, that will potentially live a full and wonderful life. I mean, I think there's something there that really tugs at me with the idea of abortion. But that, having said that, still doesn't convince me that this gives a fetus a right to life. You see, my position is that there's a bunch of assumptions being made about the fetus having the right to life from the beginning that are not argued for. So the conclusion of the argument is assumed from the beginning. However, that is the part of the right to life argument that I do like, the potentiality view, is that this being has the potential to become a human, a fully functional, conscious human being with agency, and that's incredible. We should defend that.
Thank you. I consider, from a pro-life perspective, the most intimidating argument I've heard has been more of a practical one, and it says that voting pro-life, supporting pro-life, advocating at a practical ethics level, pro-life stuff ends up creating more abortions because indirectly you're supporting a politic that creates more poverty and thus more women are driven to abortions. And so that's the logic of the argument. That was like a gut punch the first time I heard it, because I was like, if they're right, this totally reorients how I need to think about things. I think when you dig a little deeper beneath just one or two articles, it's not that hard to debunk that, and what you actually find is people who've bought into, you might say, a pro-choice culture and abortion choice ideology, blue states, blue cities, they tend to have a higher abortion rate. And so the theory generally doesn't quite pan out. You can track, say, presidential, and oftentimes it's weakly tied to presidencies, as if the president is the chief instrument for pro-life or pro-choice culture and practice. They can be relevant, but they're not really as important as, say, Congress. Congress gets to vote on these things. Communities get to, and families get to influence the behaviors of their young people and the majority demographic that's having unwanted pregnancies. So, in short, the argument doesn't really bear out. So I found that it was more bark than bite. Now, the most sophisticated philosophical argument I've heard is the violinist argument. I gather that you guys are familiar with it. I'll go ahead and share. Okay.
We have about 3 extra minutes because our first question.
Okay.
If you guys want to do the violinist argument, that'd be great.
Okay. The violinist argument, as I understand it, says that suppose a lady goes to sleep and she wakes up the next morning hooked up to this world-renowned violinist. Now, he's world-renowned, recognized, so there's high value in this person's life, so we don't have that issue clouding things. But it wasn't with her consent, and if she stays hooked up to this violinist, he can share her kidneys, I think it was kidneys, but some organ, for a duration of time. I think the first proposal was 9 months. And if he does that, then he should be able to live indefinitely afterwards. But she's locked in for 9 months. So you've got certain parallels with pregnancy. Now, the question that is posed by Judith Jarvis Thompson is that, is she morally obligated to stay connected to this violinist? And what made her argument so compelling, because it was like 1971, 72, which is just before Roe v. Wade, which was 1973. So that was a pretty important time to do this. A very pregnant time, pun intended. And so when she introduced this, she said she could even grant the right to life to a child, and this argument still holds. So she granted the beachhead of the pro-life movement human personhood, and then she said it's still not enough to deny her autonomy rights over her body. Now this is a very sophisticated argument, but there's a lot of problems that when you dig into it, it fails by disanalogy. One has consent, the other does not, except in cases of rape, perhaps, which it does.
Well, fuck off, dude.
Except in cases of rape. Natural law retaliation. I'm sorry. There's a natural law relation between the way a mother and a child are related. That's a natural law. We understand moms have a normal duty to care for their children and not harm them. That's a normal understanding, at least on the surface of things. Whereas the other is sort of an ad hoc, contrived something, that this isn't really how things work. Motherhood is unique privilege with duties. So some of what you're saying does, I think, fairly characterize a pro-life position. Motherhood is a unique privilege, but it has duties involved in it, I think, just as fatherhood does, but biologically they manifest differently. I'll speed up. One's passive killing by natural processes, the other is actively killing, and I think those are morally weighted very differently. And then, let's see, lastly, to look on one's child as an intruder, an unwanted intruder, a child in utero, I would say to treat one's own child in utero as a burglar or intruder like that, I think that's already leaning in a malicious way. That's already suggesting vice that we should be discouraging in our public practice and in our policies.
Dr. Ryan, or Dr. Hermes, do you guys want to
Well, I would just,
respond?
there's a lot that I disagree with
Disagree
with there.
Can I just, one thing you got to do, if you're dealing with Thompson, is you got to be aware that Thompson actually makes a different argument than what's actually heard, what we're actually hearing here. What Thompson does is she goes through a list of cases. Her first case, she claims, why is it that in the case of rape, the abortion should be permissible? And then she gives the violinist case. And then what she does is she moves on to a series of different cases to show that in each of these cases the same argument goes. So the objection that to Thompson, that this case only works in the case of rape, isn't really an objection to Thompson, it's a strong one against Thompson. The second thing that's really interesting about Thompson's case is if you change Thompson's case and you make it a case where the person voluntarily hooks himself up, but you then you tell the person as they voluntarily hook themselves up with this, you tell them that if you stay for 9 months, then the violence will survive. But if you leave during any period during that 9 months, the violence is going to die. And you think to yourself, I've been in the hospital for a week before when my wife had her back surgery, and that really sucks, right? So what do I think? I think, I don't know if I can make 9 months or not. So I'm not going to promise you 9 months. Here's what I'm going to promise you. I'm going to promise you that I'll try. And you make it through the first 3 months. And then you change your mind and you think, damn, I can't do it anymore. You leave. And you ask people what their response is to that case versus the initial Thompson case. And what ends up happening, I've done this now well over a few thousand students, and my response rate is near the same in the voluntary case versus the non-voluntary case, which is really neat if you ever teach Thompson, because what you really don't have to do is you don't have to go through every one of her cases. You can start with the violinist case, and then you move to the voluntary violinist case. And now the big one is your child. This is the way I end this, my Thompson lecture, is I end by saying, well, what if you moved your child? But before doing that, what you need to do in that discussion is you need to explain to the students that a lot of times we lie about when we talk about our kids, right? So when I talk about my kids, what do I frequently say? I say, my kid asks me, who do you love more? Me or Seth? I love you both the same, right? But if love is a graded concept, then the ability to actually love two people on an infinite scale at exactly the same level is mathematically impossible. So you just lied to them and you know it. And don't let your kids understand math enough that they can call you out on it, right? But now the problem, we tend to also exaggerate our responsibilities to our kids. Like if your kid, if like I could save my kid, but I'd have to like move the family to Switzerland do I have a moral, and you ask students about the moral obligation, the legal obligation, all of a sudden you get this huge change. And this actually kind of helps your case and hurts your case. What you end up usually getting in that response is that people now just jump off board on Thompson's case, argument for the moral argument. And when it comes to whether or not abortion is morally permissible, when you move it to your child, and you even you kind of prompt them a little bit about how we lie about our kids, what you end up getting from students usually is that they now disagree with Thompson on the moral side.
Can I see
But then
if
you
I,
ask the legal side, and you ask, should there be, do I have a legal obligation?
now see if
Should
I'm
there be-
understanding you
Go ahead.
correctly. Are you suggesting instead of a violinist, what if it was, say, one's 2-year-old son?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
That changes the moral weight of the
here's
system.
the way I
Okay.
teach Thompson. I start with her. First of all, you got to point out that she does not use the violinist case for all cases of abortion. She only uses a violinist case for cases of rape, and then she uses other cases. But if you try to do a Thompson paper with every case she gives, you will spend 3 weeks going through every single case, and that's way too much time in the moral prompts class to teach.
It's a very
So
significant argument.
I do Thompson in 3 stages. First stage is her initial argument with the violinist. The next stage, I move to the voluntary violinist, and you get roughly the same student response of the voluntary violinist. The third stage is you move to the child, to the violinist no longer being the violinist, but being your child. And another thing, you also get, another interesting conversation you get here is what childhood is, because what parenthood is, where that connection is. I mean, is the biological connection enough, or is there some sort of social connection that's required? But having Thompson's great for pulling out those sorts of conversations, but it becomes a lot more complicated. But interestingly, when you do make it to your own child, students do tend to jump off the moral question. They do tend to say that now there's a moral obligation. But then you ask the legal question, should they be legally required to stay? And you end up with roughly the same response rate as you had with the very initial question of her initial honors case. Here's the problem with this whole thing. It's really, you know what we need? We need like a month for the 3 of us to sit around and talk, because there's so many things I think by having the dialogue that can be done that's fruitful. And when you get 12 minutes for each of us to speak, and then we're trying to engage it,
I'm trying here.
yeah, I mean, we don't have a month, and none of you guys want to stay for a month.
We're actually on time.
Yeah.
All right. That was a good exchange. Good. All right. Dr. Ferrer, for you, Dr. Hermes, if it could be shown that it is highly likely, but not certain. You okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not trying to remember this question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If it can be shown that it's highly likely, but not certain, that in utero children have a right to life, how would that impact your position?
It's hard to figure out exactly. I think part of it is trying to figure out exactly what my position is here today. I think to a large extent my position is really, let's just have this dialogue, and let's really recognize we need the conceptual clarity. And then that question becomes really interesting to me, because I think it actually points to why I think this is so important on the abortion topic. And I think, to a large extent, why I think understanding philosophy and thinking arguments is so important. Because I think we can get to the point where we start getting something close to moral knowledge on topics. And I don't think it's just a matter of, it would have to be more than just this particular question. It would have to be the Thompson case and all. So think of all these different arguments. Suppose what ends up happening is we spend a lot of time talking about this, more than once, like years and years and years of really thinking about this. And we get to the point that we've gone through all the arguments, and we start recognizing not just that the probability goes really high for the pro-lifer or the pro-choice or whichever side, but that it gets so far in that direction that rational, well-informed, good people can't disagree, or don't disagree. That we actually get something like moral knowledge here. Then I think the way in which we need to have these conversations may change. And I think there's a point in which what we have seen, like in Berkeley, what we've seen in a lot of these cases, is there's this interesting question we have in the background of it. When is this the appropriate manner to have a conversation? Right. And when is it that things change? And a really good example of this came in the Dallas Daily News this morning. UTA campus, along with many of the other campuses along the country, have been posted by this fascist group. At UTA, the postings that we had up were, America's a white nation. And I think we have a different conversation and a different way we need to approach things when we get to that point where we get near moral knowledge. I don't think the appropriate way to respond to those sorts of things is to have this civil discourse and invite things to campus, but say there's a point where conversation ends. Abortion is nowhere near that. Good, rational people can disagree about this topic, and therefore what we ought to be doing is really spending time kind of settling out the mud. When it comes to America as a white nation, that's not a moment where we start having the conversation. That's a moment where we stand up and say there's a point where talk ends. I don't think there's anything in principle about any ethical issue that we couldn't get to that level on that ethical issue. So maybe, after hundreds of years of talking about abortion, we finally get to the point that we've got the same sort of knowledge about abortion, either pro-choice or pro-life, being the one that becomes, you couldn't really understand what's going on, and really not have a problem. If we got there,
it would seem historically that we have precedent of people in large part granting, presuming to have moral knowledge about the wrongness of abortion, and hence it was banned up until mid-60s when it started to get legalized in the U.S. So now we have people presuming to have moral knowledge. I'm not saying falsely or correctly. I'm just saying
I think this
we have both of these.
Yeah.
It's not now.
I think the worry here is what we got to watch out for is the assumption that because I haven't listened to the reasons on the other side, therefore there are no reasons on the other side.
Oh, I'm fully
I think what we have, especially in debates like the abortion debate, I think what makes this debate so frequently a bad debate, and I think that's different than what we can have. Well, what makes it so frequently a bad debate is that we don't really try to understand the same side of other sides.
I think in our prior conversation that we had before this, I was kind of fascinated that some of we seem to agree on some of the inconclusiveness about human rights and the right to life. And it sounds like you might be willing to grant that as well, Dr. Ryan, that there's at least some degree of uncertainty about at what point or where or how far we can grant the right to life, even if we might have to have some practical implications in, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or federal policy. We're not going to reach certainty on those things, but we still need to start protecting women's interests or protecting life, or we need to operate on imperfect knowledge at some point.
We're not going to reach absolute certainty because that reduces a moral problem to an epistemic problem.
Yeah.
What we need to do is present to each other, I think, good considered reasons for why one should think such a thing, why one should think this or why one should think that. And I feel that making certain assumptions right from the beginning prejudges issues, and it makes it very difficult for us to argue good reasons why we should think a certain thing. What are the good reasons to think that a fertilized egg has a right to life? You want to say that it's because it's a human being. Well, one of the conceptual problems we have here, one of the conceptual confusions is what is a human being? Well, there's a biological sense of a human being. Yes, it has the DNA of a human being. And then there's a moral sense of its being a human being. If we already say it's the moral sense, then we've already granted the right to life. We haven't argued for why it has a right to life. And so I think if we make that assumption from the beginning, it's very easy to show that that's the conclusion.
I would insert that I gave a few lines of evidence, so reasons. Now, some of them might come off as presumptuous, because 10 minutes, 12 minutes, I couldn't go into the full sourcing and whatnot, but I gave evidence that there's at least preliminary reason to consider it doubtful, or to consider it reasonably doubtful, that this human with potential, because it's not a potential human, it's already a human, this human with potential.
Biologically human, yes.
Biologically human, and that's all I argued for. I didn't argue beyond that. The key premise, I would suggest, is the life bias, which I think is a normal operating principle that would need to be debunked before the argument that I gave falls apart. That is, we need to have not necessarily evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, but we need to have more probable evidence that the life bias is an illicit presumption.
But I have given you some
Hold on
reasons.
Hold on one second. We would need better than 50% reason for thinking that the life bias is not a good operating principle in areas where we have reasonable uncertainty.
Here's I think the way we should look at this. We should say, suppose this is the principle we're going with. We're going with the fact that this is a living human being. And that's what grounds a right to life. Now we've got a problem. It can't just be the life itself that's doing it for you. Because if it's just the life itself that's doing it for you, then any living organism has the same thing. So it's got to be the fact that it's a living human being. But it can't be that it's a living human being, because if you're stuck with saying it's a living human being, then you've got the two costs I stated, I gave earlier. If you say it's just the fact that it's a living human being, then what you're stuck with is you're stuck with the claim that, well, aliens would have the same rights. You'd be stuck also with the problem that the anesthetic child, so the baby with no brain in the head would have the same problem. So if you move it to just life, that's not going to get you there. If you move it to human life, that's not going to get you. That's going to get you the anesthetic problem, and that's going to get you the other beings that have the same capacities as us not having the right to life. So it can't be that what's really doing the work here is the humanness. It can't be what's really doing the work here is the life. It's got to be something else.
So are you suggesting that there's reasonable doubt regarding the moral status of the child?
I don't think so.
You don't think there's any reasonable doubt? You don't. So let me clarify. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that there are not reasonable arguments from intelligent people on this issue who say, for example, that our right to life must take root in a non-degreed property, for example. Since people can't have more and less of a right to life, they just have a right to life. Now, they might be able to break or violate that right, say committing a capital crime or taking up arms against one's nation. But they have a right to life, and they forwent that. They surrendered it. So a non-degreed property would be a kind of thing that could potentially say, we vary in intelligence, we vary in gender, we vary in color. Those would be terrible bases for a right to life, since that means this person who's bigger has more of a right to life than this person who's smaller, or this person who is more elderly has more of a right to life than this person who is younger. This individual who is smart has more of a right to life than this one who's sleeping and doesn't have any consciousness going on.
The problem here is
But this is differences amongst organisms that are already moral beings. They're already part of the moral community. You can't compare that to an organism, the question of which, whether it is part of the moral community, is what we're discussing here.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that a normal functioning adult human being or an infant, in my view, birth is a special event that brings with it certain rights, because the organism is no longer violating a woman's rights. Okay, so by this stage, we're talking about organisms or beings who are already part of the moral community, who have moral obligations and have moral rights. We're still questioning. I still don't think that we have answered the question, and so I do agree with you that there's no certainty. And the reason for that is because there probably is no such thing as a certainty in this area. We're going to give each other reasons for thinking why we should treat the fetus or this fertilized egg as having a right to life. That is the question that we need to discuss before we can begin to talk about whether, before we've even started to talk about whether those rights clash with the woman's rights to her body, to use her body as she wishes.
That kind of moves us into our next question.
Okay.
Yeah. You had a question for Dr. Ryan. Do you believe that human beings are created equal in the sense that humans have some broad entitlement to be treated as equal under law from creation onward? If so, then why? If not, do you believe that equal rights only come later at some further stage of development, or do you reject any sense of equal rights altogether?
And so my answer to that would be, I agree that all humans in the moral sense of human have equal rights. Merely being of a biological kind doesn't seem to me to be enough to ground such a right. And so I believe that all humans in the moral sense have equal rights. From creation, no, because there's no reason to grant a right to life to an organism that is simply alive without giving us lots of reasons to do that, because we do not grant the same rights to all live things,
Can
to
I
everything
clarify
that's
my
alive.
question? It's been broadened, I think unnecessarily, to talk about all kinds of other animals. I understand our question about the right to life to be about human rights. Is that how we're understanding it?
But why?
Because I'm not talking about...
What grounds it? What grounds it because it's human?
Because I'm not fighting for the right to life regarding, mosquitoes. I hate those suckers.
But
Yeah.
But then
notice
why?
what you don't want to do is if you don't want to do this, you don't want to say it's human life. You want to say it's the right to life that beings like I have. I don't want to. Where's the difference? If I say it's human life, then my right to life and the right to life of an alien with the exact same sorts of cognitive status I have would be different rights. But that doesn't seem like the right thing to say. If I've got a right to life because of the sort of being that I am, then that alien has the same right to life if he's the same sort of being. But what we've got to figure out is exactly...
They could have a different claim. You could have alien rights to life, theoretically, but that's getting a little distorted and out there. I'm trying to be pretty practical.
But it depends on what you mean by practical. What you mean by practical and grounded is grounded in legal law, then you're giving up the concept of inalienable rights.
No, I'm talking about grounded as relevant to the interaction.
It's got to be something like me. That would I and it have the same? Would it be wrong to kill it for the same reason it's wrong to kill me? If I say no, then talking about human rights makes sense. But that's a weird thing to say. It seems like I ought to say yes. It and I have the same. It would be wrong to kill it for the same reason it's wrong to kill me.
Can I suggest a clarification? When you say it, the proper term for a human individual, to keep from objectifying an individual unnecessarily or wrongfully, he or she is a better pronoun for that instead of it.
I don't know how to talk about it.
It's a gendered individual.
When you say the
conception.
proper term,
I'm talking about aliens. I'm not sure.
Okay,
I'm not sure what the gender of ET is.
About to do some modeling.
But I do know shooting ET is wrong for the same reason it's wrong to shoot me.
Yeah.
You shouldn't kill ET for the same reason you shouldn't kill me.
It's fine. Yeah.
That is good too.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Okay. There was a line of thought, and then it just it was destroyed. And
Oh, I have thought.
what was the? We were talking about aliens.
Well, I had a follow-up question.
Yeah. Great. We have
Okay.
about 5 minutes left.
Would either of you agree that it is normal for whatever rights we do have to be bounded pretty much on all sides by the rights and potential right claims of others? So the right to swing my fist ends at your nose. I don't have a right to swing my fist anywhere because some people's faces are in the way, and that's not right. That's called assault. And so we have rights that define and delimit how far our rights can go. Would you agree with that basic premise?
I agree with that, and I agree that a fetuses for which we haven't decided yet whether or not it has rights ends at the rights of the mother or the woman for her body to be used as she sees fit.
Fetal humans, right? We're not talking about fetal horses and their mothers, right?
Right.
Okay.
Although
you're not mentioning human, and I think that bias is against that tends to objectify this individual as a thing instead of as a human. And we at least want to be fair about the science of it.
It's biologically human,
Yeah.
yes.
But notice that you don't want to do that. Because as soon as you're saying human, you're putting the stress on human as if human has moral relevance. And if you put stress on human as if it has moral relevance, then you're stuck with the argument I gave at the beginning.
Well, it's
What you
just
need to do is you need to say that
equivocating
they're
on the
human.
moral
Right.
and the
I do it,
biological meanings of human.
So here's what we need to make sure we're doing. I mean, here's the important thing not to do in a conversation like this. The important thing not to do in a conversation like this is have the words carry the motive force instead of the argument carrying where we're being driven. And I think the worry we need to worry, the worry I think both of you guys are trying to push to here with humanism, we probably ought to be thinking about, is you don't want to say this at the get-go. that the fetus does not have a right to life. And there's a really big problem with this, because you look at these sorts of rhetoric we use for the pro-choice position, and they give us also really difficult positions to say that's what's doing the work. You look at the pro-life position, and there's bullets to butt there as well. But then what you don't want to do is you don't want to stick the word human in as if human is what's doing the work, that I've got a right to life because I'm a human, because that's a really bad position to hold.
We do need good terms, though. We do need to clarify our terms.
But we've got to be careful.
Well, I would say
We're
that
not
a human
pulling
has
the
a
argument
right
of
to
work.
life in the moral sense, but that something is human biologically doesn't confer a right to life.
And my course of argument did not require an additional something beyond humanity. I would counter saying, what evidence, what amount of evidence do we have to suggest that fetal humans are not human enough to qualify for human rights? Now, to dignify your point, there's a risk I run in playing a bit of a word game where people hear human, and then I've tugged at their heart or something, and now they're picturing babies and stuff, and they're decorating the nursery or something. And that's not what I mean to do. I'm trying to suggest that it must be demonstrated that a human, a biological human, must have personhood before the life it already has can be taken from that individual rightfully. That must be demonstrated according to the life bias, which I think is a very safe
Can I
and
just add there
well-proven
that
principle.
that's the assumption that it already had the right to life. You're already assuming that because you're saying that it has to, the
As I would
argument
with
is
any
that
other individual.
it
Yeah.
has to be demonstrated. And again, individual, you're equivocating again using that term. I mean, you've said that the pro-choice argument is based on drawing a line for when it becomes a human in order to take away the right, but the right has not been given. The right has not been agreed that it has it yet
To
in
clarify,
order to be taken away.
The reasonable doubt premise that I introduce says that we don't have to be certain, we don't even have to be close to certain. We just have to have sufficient reason to not deny this individual a right to life, because it might be unjustified manslaughter, it might be criminal negligence, and it could even be murder, but I'm not going there yet.
Okay, I think we have equally good reasons to argue that it's not something that already has a right to life. Now you're saying you think that there's more than reasonably certain reasons to think that it does.
No, I'm not.
And
I'm saying that agnosticism on this issue, where we're not confident on any position here, is sufficient grounds not to exercise a policy that acts as if we're certain on the issue.
Okay, but then there's the moral certainty about the woman's rights as well. We're not certain about that. We can be reasonable. We can have reasonable doubt that we're not committing a very grievous moral harm to a woman by insisting that she's not allowed to have abortions.
The reasonable doubt.
That's a risk.
The reasonable doubt issue that I raise hinges on the life bias premise. When we're dealing with cases that are a true dilemma between a life and a life, then it can be applied. When we're talking about other rights, say a right to welfare, or a right to a living wage, or a right to the pursuit of property, I'm not asserting this reasonable doubt criteria that you have to have reasonable certainty. I'm only asserting it in cases where we're talking about a death sentence, especially one that imperils millions of children in utero each year.
Okay. Yeah. All right. All right. It is now 8:50. I guess we can go ahead and take our intermission, our 10-minute intermission. We will convene back at 9 sharp. Okay.